What if I told you that the group that suffered the most deaths in World War II were not Jews, and in fact, they weren't even in Europe? The Jewish Holocaust defines how we remember the war, largely because of the horrific stories we're constantly reminded of through films, museums, and school books. But this focus has created a deliberate gap because Asians endured one of the highest death tolls of the war, with brutality that rivals anything the Nazis carried out. The death toll count of the Imperial Japanese, by even conservative estimates, is on par with the Nazi death count, and it's easy to see why when you look at the map of their expansion. Ask anyone in China, Korea, Indonesia, the Philippines, they know this, but in the West, we are rarely told. Every Asian deaths, alongside the American soldiers who fought and died in these horrific wars in the Pacific, are largely left out of this story. Now, the reason I bring this up is partly personal. My grandfather was one of them. He was a Hawaiian soldier for the U.S. Merchant Marines. He was in the Philippines when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, and most people don't know that the Japanese kept bombing all along the Pacific. They bombed the Philippines on December 8th, just hours after the Pearl Harbor attack. That's a part we're not told. It wasn't just one island. The entire Pacific went up in flames. And for the people on the ground, the suffering was unimaginable. My grandfather hardly spoke of it during his life. But like many veterans of the Pacific, his story and the horrors that he witnessed rarely made the history books. So buckle up, because I'm prepared to tell you. We're going to walk through this and then wonder why our history is so lopsided towards Europe. This isn't about comparing victimhood. It's a sincere attempt to surface parts of World War II history that we were never taught and ask how those omissions still shape the world today. So let's begin with the death count alone. Here's a breakdown of estimated World War II deaths by Nazi Germany versus Imperial Japan. You'll notice I exclude deaths inflicted by the Allies because we are talking about just the Axis powers here. Now, many have questioned this 6 million number of Jewish deaths, and with reason. I discussed this on the Rumble version of this video because YouTube has strict rules about the Holocaust death count, so I refer you there for that important nuance. So let's leave the 6 million figure there for argument's sake, but with that asterisk. Because even if that number is exactly right, it would still place Chinese deaths far higher than Jewish deaths and yet unrepresented in Western history books. And in fact, the Soviets suffered astronomical death tolls compared to the rest of Europe, yet their story too is often left out of Western World War II history. Here today, I'm focusing on Asian deaths due to my personal connection, but the Soviet tragedy deserves equal attention. What is clear is that Japan's body count is at least on par with the Nazis, and yet largely a story untold. This is not just about numbers, but the numbers you see here are truly shocking. The Japanese committed some of the most brutal acts of violence in human history, and I have images that I am purposely not showing you, including babies bayoneted in front of their mothers, women raped, mutilated, and displayed publicly, villages infected with plague and cholera bombs. It was every bit as cruel as what the Nazis did, and in some cases more restrained. The brutality was bred into Japanese children from birth. The imperial education system glorified death in service to the emperor. Textbooks praised soldiers who slaughtered civilians. Children practiced bayoneting dolls in school. They were taught that surrender was dishonorable on behalf of themselves or the enemy. Entire generations were indoctrinated with state-sanctioned cults of violence, justified by racial superiority and divine mission. And unlike the Nazis, Japanese soldiers refused to surrender, often fighting to the death or committing mass suicide. It was a culture of violence that made the war in the Pacific uniquely savage. Now, when we think of Holocaust atrocities, most of us think of Dr. Joseph Mengele. He's known as the Angel of Death, and rightly so. His stories are horrific. He conducted inhumane medical experiments on prisoners, especially twins, dwarfs, and disabled people. He was notorious for injecting chemicals into eyes to try to change color, sewing twins together, sterilizing and mutilating people, performing procedures without anesthesia. It's the stuff of nightmares, I grant you. He escaped to South America, died of old age at 1979, having never been tried for his crimes. Well, did you know that the Japanese Imperial Army had one of these sick sadists too? His name was General Shiro Ishii. He is one of the founding fathers of the biological weapon. He created what was called plague bombs. He would bioengineer fleas and send them into villages so that they would all get the plague or cholera. It's the stuff of nightmares. He also took prisoners who were infected with the plague or syphilis and dissected them live. He took pregnant women and vivisected them to examine fetal infection. Organs were removed without painkillers to see how long the body could survive. Limbs amputated and reattached in different positions just to see what would happen. Again, I have images from this book that I am choosing not to show you, but if you want to see them for yourself, you can buy this very disturbing book. Now, you may know Carl Jha, who's been on this show many times. He's a Chinese-American political commentator. I asked him about this, and he said, every Chinese person knows about these Ishii labs. They're called Unit 731. But I ask you, why don't we in the West? Why don't we know about this? I mean, it's not fun to know about, but why do we only know about the guy from the smaller army, from the smaller death count? I'm just so curious. Now let's pivot to American soldiers who suffered in these wars. You can see here from this chart that nearly a third of U.S. combat deaths occurred in the Pacific. These veterans were sacrificed brutally at the hands of the Japanese. And in one of the few books and movies we have about this, the story Unbroken is about Louis Zamperini. He discusses how every American soldier knew that if you're captured by the Japanese, you're not coming back, or terrible, horrific things were going to happen. This is one of the stories that did survive, and it's really only for nightmares. For the rest of his life, Zamperini could not even look at rice without having a full breakdown. Now, none of this do I tell you to minimize the suffering of the Jews. I am only asking about the erasure of the suffering of the Asians. Why do we do this, and who benefits from this? Why aren't the Chinese offered the same treatment as the Jews in our retelling of this historical fact? Now, we did prosecute Nazi leaders. We built Holocaust museums. We made dozens of films, books. We gave Germany no chance to forget, but Japan has been allowed to rewrite its textbooks. Now, I'm not saying I want anything from the Japanese right now. I'm saying I want the history books to be fair. I want all victims acknowledged at this point. And in the same way, I don't want anything from the Germans. But why do we tell this story wrong? Japan became a Cold War ally. We were able to build bases in their territory. War criminals like Shiro Ishii was granted full immunity for their version of the Angel of Death. And China, they lost tens of millions of people, lived under brutal occupation, chemical and biological warfare. But unlike Israel, which receives unquestioned sympathy and billions in aid, China is cast as our villain, as a threat, even in discussions about World War II history. So who benefits from this selective memory? Well, I have a few guesses. U.S. foreign policy clearly does, because we can shield Japan as a post-war ally. We don't have to hold them accountable, and we can continue to provoke war with China, which we clearly want to do. Western institutions that center the Holocaust around only Europe have only just one easy-to-digest story, one victim group, one lesson learned, one evil regime. It's simplistic, right? Expanding the frame to include Asian victims would muddy the moral clarity and dilute institutional funding, remembrance space, political capital centered around that narrative. Obviously, the media and academia, they can rely on these myths of Western heroism, liberation, good versus evil. They don't have to complicate their narrative. Telling the truth about Japan or China would require decentering Europe and reckoning with this racial double standard, and that's bad for branding, I suppose. And then Israel is often positioned as the ultimate victim state, which it is not. It shares this with many Asian countries that are not afforded this. So what if we were to offer China or other Asian countries this victim status too? Would that be useful? I'm just curious. Would it be? So How would the world look different if we did this? It's interesting to think about. Would China still be this boogeyman? Would Japan's post-war image shatter? Would Israel no longer be the sole symbolic heir of World War II trauma? And maybe that's why this doesn't happen. So because global power, it's not about justice, clearly, it's about using this and controlling the narrative. And as I was writing this segment, it occurred to me, I had this dark thought, which maybe you will forgive me for having, but if historical victimhood were a points game, which it does seem to be in certain liberal institutions, maybe I would rank a little higher as the granddaughter of a survivor of the Imperial Japanese bombing raids, maybe even on par with someone who is a descendant of the Jewish Holocaust, right? I mean, this isn't about points. I don't want it. I have never been programmed to think that I am a victim of that. I'm just curious why no one has ever told me why this story is omitted. And it's not about, obviously, points, victimhood. It's about memory and power from the play Hamilton. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story. So as I think about my grandfather in this and why his pain is omitted from the story of World War II. So I think that the Asians deserve this memory to be corrected. I think they deserve to be added to the way we talk about the lessons of World War II. So if you agree, please share this video if you think that these stories deserve to be included into the way we remember World War II. Thanks for watching.